Ruth's boots hit the earth hard, each step pulling her closer to Abel. His shoulders were slumped, the weight of what he had done too much for him to carry. He didn't fight when she grabbed his arm, dragging him toward the old fence. The sun was low, casting long shadows across the land, but Ruth didn't care about the time of day. "Get to the fence!" she spat. Abel didn't move, just stood there, the dirt still clinging to his boots. His mouth opened, but no words came out. He swallowed hard. She grabbed his chin, forcing him to face her. "I said, get to the fence." Ruth's voice cut through the air like a blade, sharp and unforgiving. She wasn't angry. She was beyond it. She was done. Abel took a breath, then dropped his shoulders and walked the few steps to the fence. His head hung low, his steps dragging in the dust. He stopped once, twice, but Ruth didn't wait. She grabbed the worn rope, tied it around his wrist, and pulled tight. Abel winced, but didn't say anything. His breath was shallow. "You lied to me," Ruth said, her voice steady but low. "I trusted you, and you lied to me." Abel opened his mouth again, and Ruth silenced him with a harsh look. He lowered his gaze. He was shaking. His voice came out quiet, strained. "I didn't mean to, Ruth," he whispered. "I didn't mean to." The words hung there, fragile in the thick air, but Ruth didn't let them in. She couldn't. Not now, not after everything. "I told you," she said, pulling the rope tighter. "No more lies. You made your bed. Now you're going to lie in it." Abel's eyes, wide and uncertain, flicked up to meet hers. For a second, Ruth almost saw him as a child again, lost, alone, but she couldn't let herself feel it, not after everything she had been through. "You think this is easy for me?" Ruth asked, her voice steady but hard. "You think I want to do this? I don't have a choice. You don't get to tear apart what little I've got left." Abel flinched, his eyes wet. He shook his head, but Ruth couldn't stop. She wouldn't. "Say it," she said. Abel swallowed, his lips trembling. "I'm sorry," he said, the words barely above a whisper. "I swear to you, I'm sorry." Ruth stood back, her hands on her hips. She watched him. His apology felt weak. It didn't matter. Nothing mattered. She couldn't let it go, not after everything that had happened. She looked down at the rope in her hands. The knot was tight. She could feel the pulse of the earth beneath her boots, the weight of this place, of everything that had led to this moment. Ruth didn't know if it was his lie or something deeper, some secret she had buried that had her hands trembling. "Don't lie again," Ruth said. Her voice was quieter now, but just as firm. Abel's eyes were wide, too wide, like a deer caught in headlights. He nodded, a single tear slipping down his cheek, but Ruth couldn't care. Not now. Not yet. "Why, don't you say something? You've been talking all this time, but you never say what matters." Her eyes narrowed. "What did you do?" Abel's eyes flicked away, but his lips parted again. "I didn't mean to hurt anyone. I swear, Ruth." "Enough," Ruth snapped. "I don't need your excuses. What you did, what you lied about, that is the truth. Nothing else matters." Abel's body trembled under the weight of her words. The silence between them pressed down like a heavy fog. Ruth could hear his breathing, shallow, too fast, like the boy was fighting something inside. She wanted to believe him, wanted to, with every ounce of her being, but she didn't. She couldn't. Her eyes caught the faint shadows stretching across the earth. The world had gone quiet, but it was louder than it had been in years. The past, the hurt, the betrayal, it all bled together, too thick, too painful. She took a step back, her heart heavy. "You'll stay here until I'm ready," Ruth muttered, her voice low. "Then we'll see if you've learned anything." She turned away, but Abel's voice, soft, cut through the air like a knife. "Ruth," her name. His voice cracked, her steps faltered, the sound of her name in the rain. It was his plea. The weight of it hit her like a wave. For a moment, just a moment, Ruth felt her heart tighten. It was too much. Too many things she had buried, things she wasn't ready to face. But Abel had said it, and it lingered in her mind like the cold wind that wrapped itself around her shoulders. Ruth closed her eyes for a second. She heard the rain begin to fall, soft at first. She didn't turn back, but she felt the weight of him, and of everything else. And in that silence, in the soft sound of the rain, The truth, like a heavy stone, sank deep into her chest. Her hands were still shaking. She didn't look back. Not yet. Ruth couldn't stand still. Her boots dragged across the worn cabin floor, the creak of the wood echoing in the silence. The air in the room was heavy, like a storm was brewing inside her. She kept walking, from one corner to the other, her hands clenched at her sides. Her mind refused to settle. Abel was still out there, tied to the fence, a small figure in the relentless downpour. She hadn't meant to leave him there, not like that, but she had. And now she couldn't face him, not yet. The weight of the lie he told her clung to her like a second skin, the betrayal eating at her insides, his voice, his tear-streaked face. It all replayed in her mind. She could still hear him whisper her name, still feel the pull of his words, but she shut it out. The truth was clearer now than ever. She had to do this. She had to make him understand. She had to break the trust so it could be rebuilt, or it would never be whole again. Her hands were still shaking. The tremors wouldn't stop. Ruth gritted her teeth and forced herself to keep moving. She couldn't face him. Not when. Everything was so raw. The knock on the door was quick, too quick for her liking. Ruth didn't need to ask who it was. The sheriff's heavy boots thudded against the porch, a constant reminder of the world outside her small cabin. She didn't answer the door right away. The knock came again, louder this time, followed by the sound of the sheriff's voice. "Ruth," he called, his tone low but firm. "Ruth, you there?" Ruth took a breath, then forced herself to unlock the door. The cold air hit her like a slap to the face, and she stepped back to let him in. The sheriff stood in the doorway, his broad shoulders blocking the light from outside. His face was hard, his eyes scanning her face, as if looking for something she didn't want to give him. "What's going on, Ruth?" he asked, his voice steady but cold. Ruth kept her eyes down, her jaw tight. "What do you mean?" The sheriff didn't answer right away. He glanced out the window toward the fence where Abel still sat, rain falling in sheets. Ruth could almost feel the weight of his gaze on her. His silence stretched long, too long. "I heard what you did," he said quietly, not bothering to hide the judgment in his voice. Leaving him out there like that, tying him to the fence, for a lie? Ruth's chest tightened, but she didn't flinch. She stepped back from the door and motioned for the sheriff to enter, but he didn't move. He stood there, still watching her with those sharp eyes. "You're one to talk," she finally said, the words rough in her throat. "You've done worse, haven't you?" The sheriff's face tightened, his lips pressing into a thin line. "This ain't about me, Ruth," he said, stepping into the cabin and closing the door behind him. "This is about you, about what you're doing to that boy." She didn't want to hear it. I didn't want to let him in, but the way he was looking at her, like she was something broken, made her blood run cold. "I'm doing what needs to be done," Ruth said, her voice steady now, but the doubt was there, hidden just beneath the surface. "He needs to learn. He needs to understand that lies have consequences." "Does he?" the sheriff asked, his voice flat. He took a step forward, his eyes never leaving hers. "You think this is the way to teach him? By leaving him out there? By breaking him down?" Ruth swallowed hard, the words catching in her throat. She didn't know. She didn't know if it was the right way, but she wasn't going to back down, not now. "Did you want me to coddle him?" she shot back, her voice sharper now. "You think that's what he needs? Someone to tell him everything's fine? Everything's not fine. It never has been." The sheriff's face softened, just for a moment, but it was gone before Ruth could catch it. "Ruth," he began, his voice almost gentler, "I know what you've been through, but this isn't the answer. It's not the way." Words hit her like a slap. She knew what he was talking about. He wasn't just talking about Abel. He was talking about her, about what she'd been through, about the pain she carried with her, always, buried so deep she could never forget it. She opened her mouth to respond, but the words wouldn't come. The guilt, the anger, everything that had been festering inside her, it all came rushing to the surface, suffocating her. She wanted to scream, to let it all out. But the sheriff was still standing there, waiting, watching her with those eyes. Finally, she turned away, her shoulders sagging. She couldn't look at him anymore. She couldn't stand it. The weight of his stare was too much. "I'll handle it," Ruth said, her voice low, almost a whisper. "I don't need your help." The The sheriff stayed silent for a moment longer, his eyes still on her. Then, with a sigh, he turned and headed for the door. "Just remember, Ruth," he said, his voice softer now. "You can't carry all of it, not forever." The door slammed behind him, and Ruth was alone again. She didn't move, didn't speak. The weight of the sheriff's words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. She didn't know if he was right. She didn't know if she could carry all of it, but she would try. Her eyes moved toward the window, to where Abel still sat, tied to the fence. The rain had started coming harder, the sound of it deafening against the roof. She walked to the door, her boots echoing in the silence. The boy's voice, faint but clear, whispered through the storm. "Ruth!" She stopped at the door, her hand hovering over the handle. The rain had soaked him, the cold settling into his bones. He was still there, waiting for her to come, waiting for her to fix this. But she couldn't fix it. Not yet. She couldn't let herself. Ruth stood there, her heart sinking with every breath, as the storm raged outside. The weight of it all, the lies, the betrayal, the pain, it threatened to drown her. And she wasn't sure how much longer she could hold her breath before she sank completely. Ruth couldn't sleep. She lay in the bed, the sheets cold around her, the sound of the rain a constant roar against the roof. Her mind refused to quiet, the echo of Abel's voice still lingering, faint but undeniable. Ruth. The sound of his name in the storm, soft yet heavy, filled her chest with a weight she couldn't shake. She squeezed her eyes shut, willing herself not to listen, but it wouldn't stop. His voice was still there, still haunting her in the dark of the cabin. She rolled out of bed, her boots hitting the floor with a soft thud. She couldn't stay here, not with the sound of his voice still hanging in the air. The door creaked open, and the storm greeted her like an old enemy, the rain pouring in sheets, as if it had never stopped. Abel's figure was a shadow on the horizon, barely visible through the sheets of water that blurred the world around her. He hadn't moved from the fence. Ruth stepped forward, her boots slipping on the wet earth. Her heart was pounding now, fast and hard, but she kept moving, every step pulling her closer to the boy she had left out in the rain. Abel, his voice again, quieter now. He hadn't given up. He hadn't moved from his spot, but he still called her. She reached the fence, her breath ragged in the thick air. The rope was still there, frayed and twisted from the night's storm, but the boy was slumped against the wood, his head hanging low. His body was soaked through, shivering from the cold, but his eyes were still wide, staring out into nothing. Ruth didn't say anything. She just untied the rope, her hands quick but careful, her fingers stiff. The moment the knot was undone, Abel's body collapsed forward, his knees giving out beneath him. Ruth caught him instinctively, her hands going to his shoulders, steadying him as his weight fell into her. Abel didn't say a word, didn't look at her, but she could feel his chest rise and fall with each shaky breath. She helped him to his feet, keeping her grip on him tight. She didn't know what to say, but she didn't need to. His silence was enough. She could feel the cold of his body against her own, the tremors running through him. They stood there, just the two of them, drenched in the rain, the world silent, except for the steady drum of the storm. Ruth could feel the weight of everything in that moment, the weight of her decisions, of what she had done. She could see herself in the boy, vulnerable, broken. Her heart tightened, a sudden burst of guilt clawing at her chest. She had hurt him. She had hurt him so badly. And for what? To prove a point? To teach him something she wasn't sure she even believed in? His eyes met hers then, and Ruth saw it. The reflection of herself in him, not the strong woman who had carried everything on her shoulders, but a person who was just as lost, just as broken. Abel's eyes softened. He didn't look angry. He didn't look bitter. He just looked tired. Tired in a way Ruth couldn't understand, but it wasn't anger she saw in him. It was something much worse, something she wasn't sure she could face. He swallowed hard, his voice hoarse. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his words barely audible over the rain. I didn't mean to make you angry." Ruth stood there, frozen for a moment, unsure how to respond. His apology wasn't the one she'd been waiting for, but it didn't matter. It didn't matter what he said. What mattered was that she saw him. She saw the boy she'd been punishing, and for the first time, she understood that he wasn't the only one who needed to be forgiven. "I'm sorry too," Ruth said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. She didn't even know why she said it. It wasn't just for him. It was for everything. For the things she had done, the things she hadn't said, the things she'd buried deep inside her for so long. Abel didn't respond. He didn't need to. The silence between them was thick with everything they hadn't said. Ruth stood there, staring at him, feeling the weight of his vulnerability pressing down on her chest. He didn't hold a grudge. The boy didn't hate her, didn't blame her for what she'd done. And for the first time, Ruth realized that she wasn't the only one who had been hurt by the lies. She wasn't the only one carrying a burden. Ruth helped him back to the cabin, her hands gently guiding him through the storm. The rain pounded against them, but it felt different now. It wasn't just a storm. It was something else, something that was washing away the walls she had built up, brick by brick, until she was standing there, exposed and raw. They reached the cabin, and Ruth led him inside, closing the door behind them. Abel stumbled inside, and Ruth helped him to the bed, pulling the wet blanket off him and throwing it to the floor. She moved around the room in a blur, pulling dry clothes from the corner and setting them on the table. Abel was sitting on the bed now, his face pale, his eyes distant. Ruth didn't know what to say. She didn't know if there was anything to say. She walked to the window, her fingers gripping the frame. The storm was still raging outside, but it was quieter now. The wind had slowed, and the rain was just a steady rhythm, a soft, constant beat against the world. Ruth closed her eyes for a moment, breathing in the damp air. For the first time in a long time, she didn't feel angry, didn't feel the need to fight. She felt something else, something softer, but just as heavy. When she turned back to Abel, she saw him watching her, his eyes tired but understanding. He didn't need her to fix everything. He didn't need her to make it all right. He just needed her to be there. Ruth didn't know what that meant yet, but she would figure it out, slowly. For now, the silence between them was enough. Ruth's breath came in sharp bursts as she sprinted toward the fields, her boots slipping on the wet earth. Smoke billowed up ahead, thick and dark, cutting through the steady rhythm of the rain. It hadn't been raining for long, but already the fire had spread, licking at the grass like a hungry beast. Her heart pounded in her chest as she saw the flames crawling up the edge of the property, inching dangerously close to the small barn she had worked so hard to keep standing. She reached the fire, the heat burning her skin even from a distance. The flames were alive, dancing in the wind, a furious force of nature that threatened to tear everything down. She grabbed a shovel, scooping handfuls of dirt in a desperate attempt to smother the fire. But it wasn't enough. The fire spread faster than she could control it, the dry earth crackling underfoot. "Abel!" she shouted, her voice raw with panic. Abel appeared at her side, his face grim and soaked from the rain, but his eyes sharp and alert. Without hesitation, he grabbed a bucket and ran toward the well, his movements quick and practiced. Ruth didn't have time to wonder how he knew what to do. She only had time to fight. She scooped more dirt onto the fire, but it seemed to mock her efforts, leaping higher with every passing second. "Stay low!" Ruth yelled as she bent over the flames, trying to protect herself from the smoke. The heat was unbearable now, a wall of fire that pushed against her chest, suffocating and relentless. Her eyes burned with the sting of it, but she didn't stop. She couldn't stop. Abel returned with the bucket of water, throwing it on the flames. The water hissed, but it barely made a dent. Ruth grabbed his arm, yanking him to the side, as a gust of wind kicked up the fire, sending a burst of embers into the air. "Do it again!" Ruth barked, urgency in her voice. Abel nodded without a word, heading back to the well. His movements were fluid, purposeful. Ruth couldn't help but notice how capable he was, how different he seemed now than when he had first arrived. The boy had changed in ways she hadn't expected, and had shown a resilience she hadn't thought possible. Her thoughts turned inward as she fought the flames. Every time she looked at him, she saw the boy she had once thought of as a burden, but now she saw something else, something deeper. He wasn't just a reminder of her mistakes. He was a part of her own healing. He had grown up so quickly, had faced so much more than she ever had to, and yet he was here, helping her. But that didn't change what had happened. It didn't change the pain she had buried so deep inside, the grief she had locked away and tried to forget. The fire wasn't just destroying the land, it was destroying the walls she had built to keep the past at bay. Ruth's mind drifted back to the fire she had left behind, the one that had burned her family, that had left her standing alone in the ashes. She had never let herself face it, had never allowed herself to think about it. But now, as the flames spread before her, it was all she could see. The flames weren't just consuming the grass. They were consuming the pieces of herself she had tried so desperately to forget. Abel's steady hands returned with another bucket of water, and Ruth turned to face him. She had to focus. She couldn't let the fire consume her. Not again. "You can do this," she muttered to herself, her voice barely above a whisper. The words were meant for her, not him, but he heard them anyway. He met her eyes and nodded. He wasn't just helping with the fire, he was helping her face what she'd been running from. Ruth grabbed the shovel again, working in tandem with him, the weight of their shared task grounding her. The fire fought back, spitting embers that stung like 1,000 needles, but they kept going. She scooped dirt and threw it over the flames, feeling the exhaustion start to creep in. Her body ached, her hands raw, but she didn't stop. Not yet. She wouldn't let herself. The rain picked up again, heavier now, falling in the thick sheets that drummed against the earth. The ground was softening, turning to mud under their feet, but the flames didn't care. They kept growing, kept licking at the sky, climbing higher with each passing second. Ruth's chest tightened as she realized how close they were to losing everything. Abel worked with a calmness that unsettled her. His hands were steady, his movements practiced, as though he had faced fires like this before. Ruth had to stop herself from asking him where he had learned how to fight a fire. It didn't matter. Not now. All that mattered was getting it under control. The heat was unbearable now, the air thick with smoke. Ruth could feel her chest tightening, her breath coming in short, sharp bursts. But she didn't stop. She kept shoveling dirt, even when her muscles screamed at her to quit. And then, slowly, the fire began to recede. It wasn't a victory yet, but they were making progress. Ruth wiped the sweat from her brow, the rain mixing with the dirt, making her face feel raw. She didn't care, not now. The fire was dying, and that was all that mattered. Abel stood beside her, silent, his breath coming in ragged gasps, but he didn't say anything. Neither of them did. The storm had slowed, the fire almost snuffed out. Ruth turned to face the boy, her eyes meeting him for the first time since it all began. There was no anger in his eyes, no bitterness, just understanding, and in that moment, Ruth realized something. She had been trying to fight the wrong fire, the one that had been burning inside her for all these years. But Abel had shown her something else, a way to put it out, a way to let it die without destroying everything around her. They stood there, side by side, looking at the last of the flames. The air was thick with smoke, but the fire had lost its strength. It was over, and for the first time in a long time, Ruth felt the weight of her past start to lift, if only a little. The boy, the fire, they had helped her find a way to stop running, to finally face what she had buried. Ruth sat in the cabin, the weight of the fire still pressing against her chest. The remnants of smoke lingered in the air, even though the flames had long since died down. The rain had stopped for now, leaving a damp chill that wrapped around her bones. Her hands rested in her lap, unmoving, her eyes staring out the window without really seeing anything. The storm had passed, but it felt like something inside her still raged. She had thought, when she tied Abel to that fence, that she was doing what needed to be done. She had told herself that breaking him down was the only way to rebuild him. But now, with the fire behind them, she wasn't so sure. Her thoughts kept circling back to him, the boy she had punished, the boy who had never given her cause to believe he deserved it. She'd been holding on to her past fears, her need for control, instead of seeing him for who he truly was. She had seen his lies as a betrayal, but now, sitting in the quiet cabin, she started to understand. Fear had made him lie. Fear of rejection, fear of being left alone in the world, fear of something worse that she would never fully understand. She stood up abruptly, her legs stiff from sitting too long, and moved toward the stove. The fire had died down in the hearth, leaving a few dying embers. Ruth started to stoke the coals, the quiet crackling filling the space between her thoughts. The door creaked open behind her, and she didn't need to look to know it was Abel. She didn't say anything, didn't turn to face him. She just kept poking at the fire, the sound of the metal against the coals filling the room. Abel didn't speak at first. Ruth could feel him standing there, could feel his hesitation, but she didn't know what to say. She didn't know if there was anything to say. But then Abel's voice cut through the silence, soft but steady. "I'm not who you think I am." Ruth paused, her hand stilling on the poker. She didn't turn around and didn't want to see the boy's face. Not yet. She didn't want to confront it, didn't want to admit that she had been wrong, but she couldn't ignore him, not anymore. "Who do you think you are, Abel?" Ruth's voice was quiet, almost a whisper, but it still carried the weight of everything that had passed between them. Abel stepped closer. "I'm not a liar," he said, his voice firm now, though there was something else there, a crack in the hardness. "I didn't mean to hurt you. I didn't know how else to protect myself." Ruth's chest tightened, but she said nothing. Her mind churned, but it was like trying to hold on to a dream slipping through her fingers. The pieces weren't fitting together, and for the first time, she didn't know what to make of it. "Then, why didn't you tell me the truth?" she asked, still not facing him. Abel took a step closer, his voice low. "Because I didn't think you'd care." The words hit her like a slap. The silence that followed was suffocating. Ruth's grip on the poker tightened. She turned slowly, her eyes meeting him for the first time in what felt like forever. His eyes were different now, not filled with fear, but with something else, something raw, something she couldn't quite place. She took a breath. "What happened, Abel?" she asked, her voice barely more than a murmur. Abel shifted on his feet, his gaze lowering. He looked uncomfortable, but when he spoke, his words came out blunt and unguarded. "My mother died when I was little," he said, his voice tight. "I was just a kid, but I remember her face and the way she used to sing to me. She used to tell me that I wasn't alone, that no matter what, I'd always have her. But then, one day, she didn't come home. And I was alone. I had to figure it out on my own. I didn't know where to go, what to do. So, I ran." Ruth didn't know what to say. She felt the sharp sting of guilt cut through her, but she didn't know how to apologize. How could she? She'd been the one to tie him to that fence, to punish him for something she didn't understand. Abel continued, his voice steady but heavy with the weight of his words. "I lied because I didn't know how else to survive. I didn't know how else to protect myself. I thought if I kept things hidden, if I didn't let anyone get too close, I wouldn't get hurt again." Ruth felt her chest tighten, a lump rising in her throat. The fire, the smoke, the years of anger and fear. It was all pressing in on her. Abel had been through something she couldn't even begin to imagine. She had judged him. She had punished him, thinking he was just a liar. But he had been a child, lost and alone, just like her. "I'm sorry," Ruth whispered, the words barely leaving her lips. I never understood." Abel looked up at her, his eyes softening. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. His silence spoke louder than anything else. Ruth took a step toward him, her body moving before her mind could catch up. She reached out, her hand trembling, and touched his shoulder. It was a small thing, a simple gesture, but it was more than she had ever offered him before. Abel looked down at her hand, his expression unreadable. But then he met her gaze again, his face soft, and Ruth saw it. There was no anger in him, no bitterness, just understanding. "I didn't know how to trust you," Ruth said, her voice quiet, raw. "I've been running from my own demons for so long, I couldn't see past them. I couldn't see you for who you are." Abel nodded once, his eyes meeting hers without judgment. "You don't have to do it alone," he said quietly. "You don't have to hide from everything." Ruth let out a breath, the weight of it all heavy in her chest. She wasn't sure when she had started to let her guard down, but it was gone now, shattered by the boy's simple words. She could feel it, a shift deep inside her, like something was finally giving way. "I'm sorry," Ruth said again, the words coming easier now. "I'm sorry I hurt you." Abel didn't answer. He didn't need to. Instead, he turned and walked toward the small table by the window. Ruth followed him with her eyes, and for the first time, she didn't feel like she was carrying the world on her shoulders alone. The burden of trust, the weight of judgment. It was all still there, but now it felt a little lighter. They were both broken in their own ways, but maybe, just maybe, they could fix each other. Ruth heard the horse before she saw it. The rhythmic pounding of hooves against the dirt road echoed in the quiet morning, sharp and steady. She didn't need to turn around to know who was coming. The sheriff's presence had already sent a ripple through the town, and Ruth could feel the weight of it long before he arrived at her doorstep. She stood in the doorway of the cabin, her hand resting lightly on the frame, watching the figure approach. The sheriff's horse slowed as it neared, the man on it a silhouette against the rising sun. The air was still, the silence pressing down on Ruth like the weight of an old memory, a memory that had never quite left her. The sheriff dismounted with a heavy sigh, his boots hitting the ground with a soft thud. He didn't say anything at first. He just stood there, looking at her, his face unreadable. Ruth felt the tension in the air, thick and suffocating. She couldn't bring herself to speak, not yet. She hadn't seen him in years, not since everything had gone to hell, since that man had left his mark on her life and disappeared, leaving nothing but scars. The sheriff cleared his throat, breaking the silence. "Ruth," he said, his voice low, but carrying the weight of the news he had come to deliver. Ruth didn't answer right away. She didn't know what to say. Her heart raced, her breath coming faster. She tried to stay calm, to keep the walls up, but it was harder now, harder than ever before. "He's back," the sheriff said, his words quiet, but they cut through the air like a blade. "The man you've been running from." Ruth's blood ran cold. She felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. Her eyes snapped to him, and for the first time in a long while, she saw the man who had haunted her thoughts, the one who had destroyed everything she had ever cared about, the one who had made her leave, made her run. "Where is he?" Ruth's voice was barely more than a whisper, but it was enough. Enough for the sheriff to know what she was asking. The sheriff shifted on his feet, uncomfortable, his eyes darting to the side. "Does it matter?" he asked. "He's here, and that's all that matters." Ruth's heart thudded painfully in her chest. She had never wanted to hear those words. She had never wanted to know he was still alive, still breathing, still somewhere out there, waiting to tear everything apart again. She turned away from the sheriff, walking back into the cabin. The door creaked shut behind her, and she let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She couldn't think, couldn't breathe. Her mind was unraveling, thread by thread, like a rope that had finally frayed to its breaking point. "Ruth!" Abel's voice came from behind her. She hadn't noticed him standing there. He was always quieter than she expected, but now his presence seemed louder than ever. Ruth closed her eyes for a moment, trying to steady herself. The weight of everything, the sheriff, the past, the man who had stolen so much from her, it all rushed back, hitting her in waves. She felt it in her chest, in the pit of her stomach, the familiar ache that she had buried so long ago. "He's back," Ruth said, her voice barely above a whisper, as if saying the words aloud would make them real. "The man I left. The man who destroyed everything." Abel didn't say anything. He didn't need to. He could see it in her eyes, the fear, the rawness, the way the walls around her were crumbling. Ruth had always been strong. She had always fought back. But now, with him back in town, it felt like everything she had worked for was slipping through her fingers. "I can't face him," Ruth muttered, her hands shaking as she gripped the edge of the table. "I don't know if I can face him, Abel." Abel moved toward her, slow and steady, his footsteps quiet against the wooden floor. He didn't rush to comfort her, didn't try to fill the silence with empty words. He just stood there beside her, his presence solid, unyielding. "You don't have to face him alone," he said quietly, his voice steady but filled with something Ruth hadn't expected. A quiet strength that seemed to match her own, but in a way that was both gentle and firm. Ruth felt the weight of his words sink in, a sense of comfort she hadn't realized she needed. But even as the warmth of his presence settled over her, Ruth couldn't shake the feeling that her peace, the fragile, hard-earned peace she had fought for, was slipping away. "I've been running for so long," Ruth said, her voice low and raw. "I don't know if I can outrun him anymore." Abel didn't respond. Instead, he placed a hand on her shoulder, his touch warm and reassuring. Ruth didn't pull away. She didn't want to. Not now. The sheriff's warning hung in the air, thick and suffocating. The man Ruth had feared was close, closer than ever before. She could feel it in the pit of her stomach, like a knot she couldn't undo. She had thought she was free, thought she had finally outrun him, but the past had a way of catching up, no matter how far you ran. Ruth stepped away from the table, walking toward the window. She pulled back the curtain slightly. her eyes scanning the land beyond. It was quiet out there, the world still and untouched by the chaos that had just entered it, but Ruth knew it wouldn't stay that way. "Can I ever outrun it, Abel?" she asked, her voice distant as she stared out the window. "Can I ever outrun him?" Abel stood behind her, silent, sensing the shift in her emotions. He didn't have an answer. Maybe there was no answer. But Ruth knew one thing for sure. She couldn't do this alone. She couldn't face the past without someone to help her. Abel's hand rested on her shoulder, steady and warm, and for a moment, Ruth allowed herself to feel the smallest shred of hope. But even as she stood there, looking out at the land she had tried so hard to protect, Ruth knew the real battle was only just beginning. The air around Ruth was thick, heavier than the rain, that had fallen for days, thick with the weight of things unspoken, with fears long buried. She stood on the porch, the sound of the wind rushing past her like a warning. The moment she had been dreading had arrived. The man was here. He didn't knock. He didn't need to. Ruth's heart beat like a drum in her chest as she turned to face him, the shadow of his figure growing larger as he approached. His boots kicked up the dust on the dirt path, and every step he took sent a ripple through her. His presence felt like a living thing, something that reached deep inside her, stirring up everything she had tried to bury. It had been years, but Ruth could still remember the way he looked, the sharpness of his eyes, the cold smile that never quite reached them. She could feel the weight of his gaze even now, as he stood there, looking at her like she was nothing more than a memory he'd come back to claim. "Ruth," the man said, his voice smooth, like honey coating a blade. "I didn't expect to find you here." Ruth's throat tightened, but she said nothing. She didn't have to. He already knew. "I thought you'd run farther," he continued, his voice oozing with that false charm that always made her skin crawl. "But I guess this is where you ended up." Ruth didn't move. She didn't take a step back. She wasn't going to show him fear. Not now. Not after everything. The wind picked up, pushing her hair around her face, but she didn't flinch. She stood firm as the earth beneath her boots, but inside, her mind was a whirlwind. She could feel the panic rising, but she shoved it down, buried it deep. She wasn't the same girl she had been when he'd left her broken. She had learned to survive, and that's what she would do now. "You don't get to scare me anymore," Ruth said, her voice low but steady. "You've done enough of that." The man's lips curled into a smile, his eyes narrowing. "I'm not here to scare you, Ruth," he said. "I'm here because you have something that belongs to me." Ruth's breath caught in her throat. She knew what he was talking about. She had known this moment was coming. The day he would show up, wanting something, demanding more than she was willing to give. "You think I've forgotten?" he asked, stepping closer, his shadow swallowing the light at her feet. "You think I've forgotten the way you ran, the way you stole from me? I won't forget it. I won't let you forget it either." Ruth's jaw clenched. She wanted to scream at him, tell him to leave, to get out of her life once and for all. But she didn't. She couldn't. The past had a way of holding her down, of keeping her in check no matter how far she'd come. But she wasn't going to let it own her again. "You don't own me," Ruth said, her voice thick with the weight of everything she had lived through. "You never did." Abel stepped forward, his feet firm on the ground. His eyes were wide, but there was something else in them, something fierce. Ruth hadn't expected it. She hadn't expected him to stand by her. "Don't you talk to her like that," Abel said, his voice quiet but firm, a fire that Ruth had never seen in him before. The man's gaze shifted to Abel, his smile turning cold. "And who are you, boy?" he sneered. "You think you can stand up to me?" Abel didn't flinch. He didn't step back. He stood there, shoulders squared, eyes locked onto the man in front of him. Ruth could feel his presence beside her, a steady force that she hadn't realized she needed until now. "I'm not afraid of you," Abel said. "Not anymore." The man's expression shifted, the coldness turning into something sharper. He took a step forward, his voice lowering, like a threat wrapped in silk. "You should be," he said, his tone darkening. "You should be afraid of me. But I'm not here for you, boy. I'm here for what's mine, and I always get what's mine." Ruth felt a surge of anger flood through her. The old fear was there, lurking beneath the surface, but it was drowned out by something stronger now, something she hadn't known she still had in her. "You think you can take it all back?" Ruth asked, her voice gaining strength with every word. You think you can come in here and just take whatever you want? The man stepped closer, and Ruth didn't move. He was tall, towering over her, but she didn't back down. She didn't look away. The man's eyes flicked to Abel again, the tension between them rising like a storm, ready to break. You'll regret this, Ruth, he said, his voice low, dangerous. You think you're safe here, but you're not. I'm not done with you, and I won't let you forget that. Ruth's heart raced, but she kept her voice steady. Cold? You don't scare me anymore, she repeated, louder this time, more forceful. You lost that power when you left, and you'll never get it back. The man studied her for a long moment, his gaze sharp, calculating. But Ruth didn't look away. She stood her ground, her fists clenched, her breath steady. Finally, the man scoffed, shaking his head. You think you've won? He said, his lips curling into a thin, humorless smile. We'll see about that. He turned away, his boots kicking up dirt as he walked back toward his horse. You're not free, Ruth, he said over his shoulder. Not yet. And then he was gone, disappearing into the dust, leaving Ruth and Abel standing on the porch, the air still crackling with the tension he had left behind. Ruth stood there, feeling the ground beneath her feet, her heart still pounding in her chest. The fear hadn't completely gone, but it was different now. She wasn't the same person who had run before. She had Abel by her side, and for the first time in a long time, she felt like maybe, just maybe, she could fight back. Ruth stood, in the fading light, her gaze tracing the edges of the land that stretched out before her. The air was heavy with the scent of damp earth, the kind of smell that grounded you, reminding you of where you were. She had worked for this, every inch of it. The land, the cabin, the life she had carved out from the remnants of her past. The peace that had settled over her life, fragile and tenuous, felt almost too good to be true. She glanced over at Abel, his figure standing quietly beside her. He had become a constant in her world, something she hadn't expected but was thankful for. The past few weeks have been filled with hard work. Together, they tended to the land, repaired fences, and cleared the fields. They were no longer just surviving, they were building. They had planted seeds, not just in the earth, but in their lives, hoping to nurture something new, something that no longer looked over its shoulder at the past. But Ruth couldn't ignore the nagging thought that kept creeping into the back of her mind. Peace, true peace, never came without a price. The price of freedom, of safety, of the life she was trying to rebuild. It always cost more than you were prepared to give. A sound interrupted her thoughts, a soft thud of hooves on the dirt path. She turned instinctively, her heart skipping a beat. There, at the edge of the property, was the sheriff on horseback, his figure cutting through the mist that clung to the earth like a secret. Ruth's chest tightened. She had seen him around, of course. The sheriff had become an unlikely ally over the past few weeks, offering his help, his guidance, his quiet assurance that she could stay here. But it wasn't the sheriff she was wary of. It was what he represented. His presence brought with it not only the offer of protection, but the reminder that nothing in her life had ever been simple. Nothing had come without its strings, and the sheriff's help wasn't any different. "Sheriff," Ruth called as he approached, her voice steady but laced with a wariness she couldn't quite shake. He dismounted and walked toward her, his boots crunching on the gravel. His face was lined with years of service, eyes sharp and calculating, but Ruth had come to know him as a man of few words, and even fewer promises. "You've been making a good life for yourself, Ruth," he said, his voice low but measured. "This place looks like you've put your blood into it." Ruth didn't respond right away. She nodded, her eyes briefly meeting Abel's, then looking back at the sheriff. The sheriff wasn't wrong. They had worked hard for this. She'd poured everything into this land, into this life she was finally beginning to feel comfortable in. But she knew the sheriff wasn't here to give compliments. He wasn't here to offer encouragement. There was always something more. "What brings you here, Sheriff?" Ruth asked, her voice low, the question lingering between them. The sheriff paused, his hands resting on the reins of his horse, as though weighing his next words. He looked back at Abel, his gaze lingering just a moment too long before turning back to Ruth. "I've been thinking," he said slowly, "about what you said, about wanting to make a future here. The past has a way of catching up with people, no matter how hard they try to outrun it." Ruth felt the old tension tighten in her chest, the familiar sting of fear that had always been just beneath the surface. She didn't need him to remind her of that. She had been running her entire life, running from memories, from the man who had destroyed her family, from the pieces of herself that she had left behind in order to survive. "I don't need your help," Ruth said firmly, though there was a tremor in her voice that she couldn't quite control. "I've made it this far on my own." The sheriff nodded, as if he had expected this answer, but his eyes narrowed slightly. "It's not about what you need, Ruth," he said, his voice softer now, almost coaxing. "It's about what's coming. Things around here, they don't change as quickly as you might think." Ruth didn't respond. The sheriff wasn't wrong. She had known deep down that the peace she had worked so hard for was temporary, fragile. She had heard the whispers in town, seen the way people looked at her when they thought she wasn't paying attention. The past had a way of catching up with you no matter how hard you tried to bury it. The sheriff seemed to sense her hesitation, stepping forward slightly, lowering his voice even more. "I can offer you more than just advice, Ruth," he said, his tone shifting. "I can give you protection. I can make sure no one bothers you here, but you have to make your choice. This place, this land, it's not just yours for the taking. It comes with responsibilities, and people don't forget easily." Ruth's pulse quickened. The threat was thinly veiled, but it was there, lurking in his words. There was no escaping the truth. Nothing in her life had ever come without a price. Even now, the peace she had worked so hard to build was threatened by the weight of the past. Abel stepped forward then, his eyes narrowing, his voice strong, despite the fear that Ruth could see flickering in his eyes. "What are you trying to say?" he asked, his tone steady, but Ruth could feel the tension in his body. The sheriff looked between them, his expression unreadable. "I'm just offering a choice," he said, his voice flat now. "You can take it or leave it, but don't be fooled into thinking things will stay quiet forever. Not with the kind of history you're carrying." Ruth's chest tightened, the weight of his words sinking into her bones. She had known this was coming. She had always known there would be a price for peace. She just hadn't expected it to come so soon. "I'll handle it," Ruth said, her voice firm. "I've handled everything else?" The sheriff studied her for a long moment, then gave a sharp nod. "Just remember, Ruth," he said quietly, his voice lower now, almost a warning. "Nothing is ever truly free, not here, not anywhere." He turned and walked away, mounting his horse with practiced ease, his silhouette fading into the mist that was beginning to rise again over the land. Ruth stood there, her mind racing, the weight of his words pressing against her chest like a stone. She had fought so hard for this, for peace, for freedom, for the life she had built. But now, standing there, looking out at the land she had claimed as her own, she realized that even in peace, there was always a threat. Always a cost. Abel stood beside her, his presence a quiet reassurance, but Ruth could feel the shift in the air. The price of peace had come, and now she had to decide how much she was willing to pay. Ruth's hand trembled slightly as she wiped the sweat from her brow. The sun was beginning to set, casting a golden hue across the land she had fought so hard to reclaim. Each day had felt like a battle, each task a reminder of what she had lost and what she had gained. And every day Abel had been there, standing beside her, working silently, offering his steady presence like an anchor to a ship lost in a storm. But the storm inside her was different. It was growing, relentlessly. She had known from the start that he wasn't just a burden. He wasn't the child she had tried to protect out of fear. Number Abel was something else entirely, something more. Her hands shook as she placed the bucket of water down, her thoughts flickering back to the first time she had seen him, tired and vulnerable, standing in the rain. He had been nothing more than a boy to her then, a reminder of everything she had wanted to forget. But now he was more than that. And that was the problem. Abel had begun to carve a space in her heart, a space that she hadn't allowed anyone into for years. She hadn't let herself care for anyone since the last time she had trusted someone, only to have it all ripped away from her. The memory of that betrayal, that loss, sat heavily in her chest, reminding her of the walls she had built around herself. She had sworn never to let anyone close again, but Abel's quiet strength, his steady hands, his soft words when she needed them most, They were breaking through those walls, piece by piece. She heard him before she saw him. His footsteps were light on the dirt path, but they were steady, confident, like he knew exactly where he was going. And when she turned to look at him, his eyes met hers with that same quiet understanding that had always been there. He didn't need to ask if she was okay. He already knew the answer. "Ruth?" Abel's voice was soft, but there was an edge to it, a hint of concern that Ruth couldn't ignore. He stepped closer, his presence filling the small space between them. She felt the pull of him, even though she tried not to. It was always like this now, an invisible thread drawing her toward him, one she wasn't sure she could break free of. "I'm fine," Ruth said, her voice firmer than she felt. She straightened, pulling away from him, as if putting distance between them would somehow quiet the storm inside her. But it didn't. It never did. "You don't have to be," Abel said, his voice quieter now, as if he understood her more than she wanted him to. "You don't have to hide from me." Ruth's chest tightened. The words he said weren't just about today, about the work they had been doing, about the land they had been rebuilding together. No, they were about something deeper, something Ruth had been trying to bury, the truth that she had been fighting for so long. "I'm not hiding," Ruth replied, though the lie felt sharp in her throat. "I'm fine." Abel stepped closer, his eyes never leaving hers. "It's okay to not be fine, Ruth," he said softly. "You don't have to do this alone." The weight of his words pressed down on her. She had never allowed herself to rely on anyone, not since everything had fallen apart. The betrayal of those she had loved had scarred her in ways she couldn't explain. Every time someone got too close, she felt the walls go up again, the need to protect herself becoming almost overwhelming. But Abel wasn't like the others. He wasn't asking her for anything. He wasn't demanding her trust or her love. He was just there, just standing beside her. Ruth felt a flicker of something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. A warmth, a longing, something that scared her. She had built this life on the foundation of survival, but survival alone wasn't enough anymore. She needed something else. But could she let herself have it? Could she let herself feel something more for Abel, knowing the price that might come with it? The fear was suffocating. Every time she even considered it, her heart clenched in protest, reminding her of all the pain that had come before. "Ruth," Abel said again, his voice softer this time, almost a whisper. "I'm here, whatever you need." Ruth closed her eyes for a moment, the emotional weight crashing over her. She wasn't just afraid of loving again. She was afraid of needing someone, needing Abel in a way that would leave her vulnerable. She had been so careful to guard herself, to keep her heart locked away, but Abel had started to chip away at that. His quiet presence, his patience, his willingness to stay when she had pushed him away, it had all been too much to ignore. "I don't know what you want from me," Ruth whispered, her voice barely audible in the stillness of the evening. Abel didn't respond immediately. Instead, he reached out, his hand warm and steady on her shoulder. Ruth stiffened at the contact, but she didn't pull away. The touch was grounding, familiar. She had never realized how much she had needed it until that moment. "I don't want anything from you, Ruth," Abel said gently, his voice filled with an understanding she hadn't expected. "I'm not asking you for anything. I'm just here." Ruth swallowed hard, her chest tight. "But I don't know how to do this," she admitted, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. "I don't know how to let anyone in again." Abel's hand remained on her shoulder, his grip unwavering. "You don't have to know," he said quietly. "You don't have to have all the answers. You just have to trust me." Ruth's mind was spinning. Trust. Could she trust again? Could she let herself believe that Abel wasn't like the others? The fear, the doubt, the past, it all clung to her like a heavy fog, but Abel's words, his quiet strength, were starting to cut through it. For the first time, Ruth didn't feel like she had to carry it all alone. She didn't have to fight this battle by herself. Maybe she didn't have all the answers, but for the first time in a long time, she didn't need them. She turned toward him, her heart racing, and finally, for the first time, she let herself believe in something more. She stepped forward, closing the distance between them, and let her hand rest over his. The storm inside her had not disappeared, but the feeling of Abel's warmth against her, of his steady presence beside her, began to calm it. And in that moment, Ruth realized that maybe, just maybe, she was ready to stop running, to stop guarding her heart, to start letting someone in, not just for survival, but for something more, for love, for peace, for the future. And as she stood there, her hand resting in his, she knew that no matter what came next, Abel would be there, steady and unwavering, and that, for now, was enough. Ruth sat alone on the porch, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, the soft hum of the wind, the only sound filling the silence. The sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows across the land she had fought so hard to claim as her own. But today, the land felt distant, as if it belonged to someone else entirely. Her mind was a storm, and no matter how much she tried to calm it, the past had a way of resurfacing, always reminding her of the things she had left behind. Abel stood quietly beside her, his presence a steady warmth against the coldness of her thoughts. He hadn't said a word, just remained there, standing close enough to offer his strength, but far enough to give her the space she needed. Ruth felt the weight of his quiet empathy, and it was like a balm to the rawness of her soul. He didn't ask for anything. He simply gave, and in his silence, she found a comfort she hadn't known she needed. The quiet stretched on, and Ruth's thoughts began to drift back to the days when everything had seemed so certain, back when her family had been whole, before the betrayal, before the darkness crept in, and he stole everything she had ever known. She had buried those memories for so long, but now they came rushing back, sharp and unforgiving. The betrayal had been swift, a knife to the heart when she least expected it. Her own flesh and blood had turned on her, leaving her with nothing but ashes. The grief had settled into her bones, a heavy, unshakable weight. She had survived, yes, but it had come at a cost. She had locked away the parts of herself that loved, that trusted, because to do otherwise meant risking everything again. And now, as she sat there, feeling the presence of the land and the silence between them, Ruth realized that she couldn't keep running from it. The past had shaped her, yes, but it did not have to define her forever. She had spent so long fighting the ghosts of the past, trying to outrun them, but they had never let go. Abel shifted beside her, his presence grounding her, and Ruth turned to look at him. His gaze was steady, his eyes filled with an understanding that she hadn't expected, but needed more than she realized. "You don't have to speak," Abel said, his voice quiet but sure. "I can see it in you. I see the weight of it, the pain you carry." Ruth didn't respond immediately. The lump in her throat tightened, but she didn't speak the words she had been holding in for so long. The truth, the full weight of it, was more than she could bear. The loss of her family, the feeling of being torn apart, the guilt that had settled in her chest, suffocating her. But Abel's words, his understanding, broke through the wall she had built around herself. He wasn't asking her to forgive or forget. He was simply offering her a place to stand, a place to breathe. "I don't know how to let it go," Ruth whispered, her voice trembling slightly. "I don't know how to stop carrying it." Abel didn't answer right away. He simply placed his hand on hers, a simple gesture, but one that spoke volumes. His touch was steady, patient, like the calm in the midst of a storm. "You don't have to let it go," Abel said quietly, his voice filled with a quiet wisdom. "You just have to keep going. Healing isn't about forgetting. It's about living despite the past." Ruth closed her eyes, the truth of his words settling deep in her chest. For so long, she had thought healing meant erasing the scars, letting them fade into nothing. But it wasn't about that. It was about living with them, carrying them, but not letting them define who she was. She looked up at him then, seeing in his eyes a reflection of her own pain, but also something else. A strength, resilience, something that had grown in both of them, side by side, as they had worked to rebuild what had been broken. The weight of it all, the betrayal, the loss, was still there. But in Abel's quiet strength, in the way he had never asked her to be anything but herself, Ruth found the courage to stand up again. The past would never fully go away. But she didn't need to forget it to move forward. "I'm still learning," Ruth said softly, her voice steady now. "But I'm starting to understand." Abel's smile was small but sincere, a quiet acknowledgement of the journey they had both been on. There was no need for grand words, no need for anything other than the unspoken bond between them. Ruth let out a breath she didn't realize she had been holding. She didn't know what the future held. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring. But for the first time, she felt like maybe, just maybe, she could finally start to let go of the weight of the past. She didn't have to outrun it anymore. She didn't have to fight it. Healing wasn't about forgetting. It was about choosing to live, despite everything. And Ruth, for the first time in years, felt like she was ready to do just that. Ruth stood at the edge of the land, her eyes fixed on the horizon as the first light of dawn touched the earth. The air was cool, still, and the world felt quiet, as if holding its breath. For a moment, everything felt possible. The weight of the past, the betrayal, the fear. It all seemed distant now, like shadows fading with the light. Beside her, Abel stood just as still, his presence steady and calm. They had worked together, side by side, for so long now, and the bond between them had deepened in ways Ruth couldn't fully explain. It was more than just survival. It was trust. It was understanding. It was a connection that had grown out of the soil of their shared struggles, nurtured by their quiet moments and the weight of everything they had overcome together. The past few days had been quiet, almost too quiet. The land was thriving, the crops growing strong, and the barn they had worked to restore stood tall against the sky, a symbol of everything they had fought for. But even in the peace, there was always a reminder of what lingered: the sheriff's warning, the specter of the man who had returned, the unspoken tension that still clung to the edges of their lives. Ruth could feel it, the constant hum of uncertainty. The sheriff's words echoed in her mind, warning her that nothing was ever truly free, that peace came at a price. She had known that from the start, but hearing it again, so close to everything she had worked for, made the fear in her chest flare up again. "He's right," Ruth said quietly, her voice barely more than a murmur. "The past never really lets go. We can't outrun it." Abel didn't respond immediately. He didn't need to. He simply stood there, his presence solid and unwavering, as if saying that words weren't always needed to understand each other. He knew. He had seen the scars Ruth carried, the way she had fought so hard to build something, only to feel like the ghosts of her past were still looming over her. "We don't need to outrun it," Abel said finally, his voice low but steady. "We just need to keep going, together." Ruth turned to look at him, meeting his gaze. There was something in his eyes now that hadn't been there before. A quiet strength, a certainty in what they had together. The fear she had felt earlier began to ease, replaced by something else. Something softer. "You're right," Ruth said, her voice firming as she spoke. "We can't change the past, but we don't have to let it control us." Abel nodded, a small but significant gesture. It was more than just agreement. It was an understanding, a shared realization that the future wasn't something that would happen to them. It was something they would shape together. For so long, Ruth had thought of herself as alone, fighting against the world, fighting against the things that had hurt her. But now, with Abel beside her, she realized that she didn't have to carry it all on her own. They were equals in this, not just survivors, but people with the power to build something new. Her heart felt lighter, the weight she had carried for so long slowly beginning to lift. The sky was clearing now, the sun rising higher, casting its golden light over the fields, the cabin, the land that was theirs. It felt like a new beginning, a fresh start, not just for the farm, but for them. The challenges they had faced, the ones they would continue to face, were still there, but Ruth felt a shift inside her. She wasn't alone anymore, and neither was Abel. "Whatever comes next," Ruth said, her voice steady, "we'll face it, together." Abel looked at her, his gaze steady, and for the first time, Ruth saw the same quiet determination in him. He wasn't just standing beside her out of obligation or pity. He was standing beside her because he believed in this, in them, as much as she did. "We will," he agreed, his voice full of certainty. "We've already made it this far." Ruth felt a sense of peace settle over her, fragile but unbreakable, like the land beneath their feet. The future was uncertain, yes, but it was theirs to create. No matter what the sheriff had warned, no matter what shadows from the past tried to rise up, Ruth and Abel would face it together. For the first time, Ruth didn't feel the burden of her past dragging her down. She didn't feel the fear of what could come next. She felt hope, and it wasn't a fleeting hope. one that could be easily shattered. It was a deep, steady hope that had been forged in the fires of everything they had already endured. And in that moment, Ruth understood something that had eluded her for so long. Healing wasn't just about overcoming the past. It was about choosing to move forward despite it, choosing to live despite everything that had tried to break them. As the sun rose higher, casting its light across the land, Ruth knew that whatever came next, whatever challenges they would face, she and Abel were ready. They were stronger than they had been before, their bond tested and forged in the fires of their shared struggles. And that bond, fragile as it might seem, was unbreakable. They stood together, side by side, facing the future, ready. The storm rolled in quickly, its dark clouds swallowing the sky, the wind picking up and pushing through the trees. Ruth stood on the porch, her body tense as the first drops of rain began to fall. The storm was coming, just like the ones before it, the ones that had torn through her life and left nothing but wreckage behind. But this time, she wasn't afraid. Abel stood beside her, his presence solid, unwavering. The rain began to pour harder, but he didn't flinch. Neither of them did. They both stood there, facing the storm, their shoulders squared, their feet rooted in the earth they had fought so hard to claim. The storm had always been a symbol of what they couldn't control, of the forces that threatened to break them, to wash everything away. Ruth had spent so many years running from the storm, hiding from the chaos that seemed to follow her. But now, in the midst of it, she stood tall. She wasn't running anymore. The rain hit her face, cold and relentless, but she didn't wipe it away. She let it soak her, let it wash over her, feeling the weight of everything, the loss, the betrayal, the fear, start to slide away, piece by piece. Abel didn't speak. He didn't need to. His silence was enough. Ruth had always thought she needed to hide from the past, that the only way to survive was to outrun it. But now, with Abel standing beside her, she realized something different. Redemption wasn't about escaping the past. It was about embracing it. It was about choosing to move forward, despite everything that had happened, choosing to live despite the ghosts that still haunted her. She glanced at Abel, his face set, his eyes focused on the horizon, where the storm was beginning to break. They had both been through so much, but here they were, standing together, unbroken. The bond between them wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about something deeper, a strength forged in the fire of their shared struggles, a love that had grown out of their pain and their healing. Ruth felt it now, the quiet strength that had always been there, but had been buried under fear for so long. She wasn't alone. She hadn't been for a long time. Abel had been there, even when she didn't want him to be, even when she thought she didn't need anyone, but he had stayed, and in that staying he had given her something she hadn't realized she'd needed, the strength to face the storm. The rain began to slow, the clouds breaking apart as the first hints of sunlight peeked through the sky. Ruth took a deep breath, feeling the cool air fill her lungs, feeling something shift inside her. This wasn't just the end of the storm, it was the beginning of something new. She and Abel had faced the worst of it, together, and now, together, they were ready for whatever came next. The storm had passed, and with it, so had the fear. The past still lingered, but it no longer had a hold on her. She was no longer bound by what had happened, no longer controlled by the things she couldn't change. The final image was one of quiet strength, of renewal. The rain had stopped, but the world felt different now. Ruth stood there, looking at the horizon, and for the first time, she felt something she hadn't in a long time: hope. And she knew, with Abel by her side, they would face whatever came next, together.